It's my pleasure now to introduce Florence Williams. Florence is a prize-winning journalist, contributing editor at Outside Magazine, and a freelance writer for the New York Times and numerous other publications. Her book, Breasts, A Natural and Unnatural History, received the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Science and Technology and was also named a notable book by the New York Times. It's a favorite of Silent Spring staff because she gets the science right and manages to be funny while telling the straight story about everyday chemicals that affect health. As a science journalist and a new mother, she became interested in chemical pollutants in breast milk. When she wanted to learn more, she sought out the Silent Spring Institute because of its leadership in research on consumer product chemicals. In 2011, Florence and her then 7-year-old daughter collaborated with Silent Spring to conduct an experiment to reduce their body burden of chemicals from plastics and other household products. She tells me now that sweet child doesn't hardly speak to her anymore. Teenager, all the more reason to get these answers and keep these kids safe. Florence.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you, Julia. I have to say the energy in this room is really incredible. I've already met so many interesting women with very powerful stories. And of course, the staff of Silent Spring, I've had the privilege to get to know a little bit through some of my work, and I salute all of you. It's really a privilege to be here. I did not set out to write a book about breast cancer. I actually started down this journey, this path, because I was interested in breast milk. I was nursing my daughter, and I saw some research reports that there were industrial chemicals in breast milk, particularly a class of flame retardants, PBDEs. I think we'll probably hear about flame retardants. We've already heard about them a little bit. And they were actually doubling in American women's breast milk every 5 years. So I wanted to tell this story, and it occurred to me that I had breast milk, and I could actually have it tested, which wasn't so easy to do then. There weren't very many women who'd been tested. So I found a lab in Germany, and we FedExed a vial of my breast milk across the Atlantic, and I wrote about it for the New York Times Magazine. The results came back that I had flame retardants, these PBDEs, in my breast milk, even higher than the U.S. average. And American women, by the way, had the highest levels in the world, 10 to 100 times higher than women everywhere else. And that's because of that California flammability standard that Julia mentioned. So I also had a jet fuel ingredient, and I also had pesticides. Those were really the only ones we looked at. But I had to wonder why I was feeding these things to my daughter, in addition to all the immune boosting and nutritional sort of miraculous properties of breast milk. It led me to ask some other questions. I wanted to know how else modern life has changed breasts. And I found out some interesting things. I found out that breasts are actually bigger now than ever before. And some people think, no doubt, that that's a fine thing. But it's not necessarily, because it also means that our bodies are just fatter, not so good for our health. And by the way, men are also getting bigger breasts, and boys. And then I also found out that girls are developing breasts at younger and younger ages. And this really is a concern, because we know now that early puberty is a risk factor for breast cancer later on. And also that these girls are at higher risk for substance and sexual abuse, and also for depression. And then, of course, I also learned that breast cancer rates have increased 40% since World War II, not just because of better detection. In fact, the groups with the biggest increase in breast cancer are women under 40, and they don't get mammograms. And breast cancer is also increasing in men, and I have a chapter about that in my book. So I wanted to dig deeper into the breast as an ecological organ. So I learned that the breast is designed by evolution to be conversant with the world around us. It's filled with hormone receptors, The breast is an incredibly complicated organ. It's constantly changing. It's shrinking and growing mammary glands and shrinking mammary glands. And it does all this by hormonal signaling. And it's really receiving signals from a very different world than it once did. Since I'd already experimented on myself, I decided to keep going. So I tried to find out where the flame retardants in my breast milk was coming from. I did some dust testing in my house because each of these congeners of these flame retardants have a different signature, and you can link it to sort of upholstered furniture or thermal plastics or television set. And then I actually took core samples of some of my sofas. And I'd like to say, you know you're living in a strange world when you're biopsying your furniture. So then I recruited my 7-year-old daughter because we know that adolescence is a really critical window of vulnerability for exposure to carcinogens. And there are a number of people looking at what kinds of exposures they're getting that may be partly driving this early puberty and sending these estrogenic signals into their breast tissue. So that's where I crossed paths with Silent Spring. And I worked with toxicologist Ruth Ann Rudell, and we set up this experiment in which first we sort of lived like normal Americans, and we just consumed a little bit of soda. I have a secret weakness for Fresca. We ate some canned beans. We took bubble baths. We slathered on just, moisturizer. It wasn't anything extreme. These were all products bought in the supermarket. And then we peed into a cup, and my daughter thought this was a lot of fun, fortunately. She was game. Now, as anyone on Celebrity Rehab will tell you, detox is not nearly as fun. So a few days later, we went into detox, and that meant that we became vegans because the animal fats sometimes attract some endocrine-disrupting compounds. I didn't use any really hygiene products at all. I probably didn't smell too good after a few days. I didn't drive in a car. I didn't ride in a car because of the phthalates off-gassing from your interiors. We were looking basically at 4 compounds known to alter chemical responses in the bodies. We were looking at BPA, which you probably know about. That's found in the lining of tin cans and in polycarbonate plastics. We looked at phthalates, which are also commonly found to soften plastics and as scent stabilizers in personal care products. We looked at parabens, which is a preservative found in a lot of face creams and things like that. And we looked at triclosan, which is an antimicrobicide found in over 90% of commercial soaps. So when we got the results back, it was really interesting. We found that, in fact, we were able to sort of boost our levels a little bit to these kind of, a little bit higher than average American levels. And then for some of the substances, after detox, we dropped our levels like 80 or 90%. For BPA, for example, 85%. But for some of the compounds, even after detox, we could not really make a dent. Even after detox, I had some levels of some phthalates that were still sort of 65% of the American average. My daughter had some phthalates that were 95% higher. She was over the 95th percentile, which meant that she had higher levels than 95% of girls her age, and that was after detox. So this was weird because we just couldn't even figure out, where we were getting these exposures. And so that was really telling for me. When we buy products, they're not labeled with endocrine-disrupting compounds. So it was kind of concerning and confusing, and I wanted to figure out what it meant. And of course, just because you have these chemicals coursing through your mammary gland tissue, including 7-year-old mammary gland tissue, it doesn't mean they're doing harm. But what was so sort of disturbing was that the EPA wasn't really asking the question. No one was really asking the question whether these chemicals were doing harm. The EPA was not testing for low-dose endocrine-disrupting effects of chemicals. And when it was doing traditional toxicology tests, it was not testing the mammary gland. It was actually discarding the mammary gland of lab animals, even though we know that the mammary gland is one of the most sensitive solid organs in the body for growing tumors. No one was really looking at that. And Silent Spring Institute has actually been really critical in getting that issue into the conversation among regulators. And that's an amazing thing that they've done, and I salute them for it. So many anthropologists used to say, or some of them still say, that the breast is a sexual signal. This is something that has been going on for decades. They say that it's a signal that it conveys information to potential mates. And that's why it's shaped very uniquely, actually, in the mammal kingdom. But the way I see breasts, I see them as a different kind of signal. I see them as a sentinel organ. I see that they convey information to us about the world we live in. And they challenge us to think differently about the environment and our health. And they challenge us to think differently about the way we do science. If we listen to them, they have much to say. Thank you very much.